80 years, one alliance, and a single handshake in Beijing that just ended the foundation of American power in the Middle East. That's not an exaggeration. That's the operational reality of what's been unfolding in Riyadh over the past 3 years, and almost no one in Washington is willing to name it plainly. The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone arrangement that has structured global energy markets, dollar dominance, and Middle Eastern security architecture since 1945, is being quietly disassembled in real time, not through a dramatic break, not through a public denunciation, through something far more dangerous to American interests, a series of small, deliberate, technically legal decisions that individually look minor and collectively represent the largest strategic realignment in the region since the fall of the Shah. The consequences are already moving through your daily life, even if no one has connected the dots for you. The price of every gallon of gasoline at every pump in America is now influenced more by decisions made between Riyadh and Beijing than by any conversation happening in Washington. The dollar's role as the exclusive currency for global oil settlement, the arrangement economists call the petrodollar system that has underwritten American economic power for 50 years, is being chipped away one bilateral agreement at a time. The security guarantees that justified hundreds of billions in American defense spending across the Gulf region for 2 generations are being recalibrated by a Saudi leadership that no longer believes those guarantees mean what they used to mean. This channel runs on no corporate funding, no government backing, and no advertising pressure telling us what to leave out. If you want the analysis that mainstream outlets won't run, the kind that follows the diplomatic cables and the commercial contracts instead of the press conferences, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. What's happening between Riyadh and Washington right now is going to define the next phase of global economic order, and you'll want to understand it before the consequences arrive in headlines. Now let's get into what actually happened because the official narrative and the operational reality are telling two completely different stories. The standard explanation in Western capitals describes the current friction in US Saudi relations as a temporary disagreement, a personality dispute between leaders, a misunderstanding that will resolve once the right diplomatic adjustments are made. That explanation is comforting. It fits the worldview that Western audiences have been trained to accept. And it is wrong in ways that matter because it allows policymakers to keep believing that the underlying alliance remains intact when the underlying alliance is being actively reconstructed on terms favorable to a different superpower. Here's what the evidence actually shows. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran announced the restoration of diplomatic relations after 7 years of severed ties. The announcement happened in Beijing. The brokering was done by China. The United States was not informed in advance, was not involved in the negotiation, and was not given a substantive role in the outcome. That single event, more than any other in the past decade, marked the moment when the Saudi leadership signaled publicly that Washington was no longer the indispensable security guarantor for managing the most consequential rivalry in the Persian Gulf. Beijing was. The implications of that signal have been unfolding ever since, and almost every subsequent Saudi decision has reinforced rather than walked back the underlying message. Consider the OPEC Plus production decisions that have repeatedly contradicted explicit American requests over the past 3 years. When Washington asked Riyadh to increase oil production to ease American gasoline prices ahead of consequential elections, the Saudi response was to reduce production, not maintain. Reduce. The reductions were coordinated with Russia through the OPEC Plus framework that did not exist before 2016, and that increasingly functions as a parallel energy governance structure outside of American influence. Each production decision was technically defensible on commercial grounds. The cumulative pattern was unmistakably political, and it represented a Saudi leadership that no longer felt obligated to subordinate its commercial interests to American electoral calendars. Now, here's the technical breakdown that almost nobody in mainstream media is willing to put on a single chart. Start with the petrodollar mechanism because everything else flows from understanding how that system actually works. Since 1974, the foundational arrangement between the United States and Saudi Arabia has involved Riyadh pricing its oil exclusively in dollars, recycling the resulting dollar surpluses into American Treasury securities and other dollar denominated assets, and accepting American security guarantees in exchange for that financial cooperation. That arrangement created structural demand for dollars across global energy markets, allowed the United States to run persistent fiscal deficits at lower borrowing costs than would otherwise be possible, and made every other oil importing nation a captive customer of the dollar financial system, whether they liked it or not. That arrangement is now being modified at the edges in ways that look small but compound dangerously over time. Saudi Arabia has begun accepting partial yuan settlement for oil exports to Chinese refiners. The volumes are still modest as a percentage of total Saudi exports. The precedent is enormous. Once one Gulf producer breaks the dollar only convention, the commercial logic for other producers to maintain that convention erodes rapidly. The United Arab Emirates has been building yuan clearing infrastructure for years and is positioned to follow whenever the political timing is favorable. Kuwait, Qatar, and Iraq are watching. The dollar's monopoly on Gulf oil settlement, which underwrote American economic power for 2 generations, is dissolving one bilateral agreement at a time. Read that sequence again carefully. The collapse of an exclusive arrangement does not require a dramatic announcement. It requires a series of exceptions that gradually become the new norm. That is exactly what is happening, and it is happening on a timeline that Western policymakers have consistently underestimated. Move to the security dimension because that is where the realignment becomes most visible to professional analysts. Saudi Arabia has signed a series of defense and technology cooperation agreements with China over the past 4 years that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Cooperation on ballistic missile production, cooperation on civilian nuclear technology with components that have potential dual use applications, acquisition of Chinese drone systems for both surveillance and combat applications, discussions, repeatedly reported and never definitively confirmed, about Chinese involvement in Saudi air defense modernization. Each individual agreement can be defended as commercial diversification. The cumulative pattern is the construction of a parallel security relationship that reduces Saudi dependence on American weapons systems, American training, and American operational support. Here's the dimension the Pentagon would prefer you didn't think about. American defense exports to Saudi Arabia have historically created a long-term dependency relationship that locked the kingdom into the American security architecture for decades after each individual sale. Spare parts, maintenance contracts, pilot training, software updates, joint exercises. That dependency was a feature of the arrangement, not a bug, and it gave Washington structural leverage over Saudi behavior that complemented the formal security guarantees. The introduction of Chinese systems into the Saudi inventory begins to dissolve that dependency. Each Chinese platform acquired is one fewer American platform that creates lock-in. The strategic value of that shift compounds over time in ways that no single contract reveals on its own. Now let's run the math because this is where the asymmetry becomes impossible to ignore. The bilateral trade volume between Saudi Arabia and China crossed roughly $100 billion in recent years and has been growing at a pace that significantly outstrips the equivalent figure for Saudi American trade. China is now the largest single buyer of Saudi crude, taking roughly 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day, depending on the quarter. The United States, by contrast, has dramatically reduced its imports of Saudi oil over the past 15 years as American shale production transformed the country into a net energy exporter. That commercial reality has consequences that diplomatic statements cannot reverse. The country that buys your oil in growing volumes matters more to your economic future than the country that used to buy it but increasingly does not. Consider what this means for Saudi's strategic calculation. Every additional barrel of crude flowing from Riyadh to Shanghai is a barrel that ties Saudi commercial interest to Chinese economic stability rather than American economic stability. Every yuan denominated settlement is a transaction that builds the financial infrastructure for a non dollar oil market. Every defense cooperation agreement is a step toward reducing the operational dependency on American military partnership. The math is brutal, and it explains why Saudi leadership has become progressively less responsive to American pressure across multiple consequential decisions over the past several years. The ratio of dependency has been quietly inverted. For decades, Saudi Arabia depended on American security guarantees more than the United States depended on Saudi oil. American shale production changed the second half of that equation. Chinese energy demand changed the first half. The result is a Saudi leadership that calculates its strategic options across a much wider menu than was available a generation ago, and that responds to American requests with a politeness that no longer translates into compliance. Now, zoom out to the broader regional architecture because Saudi Arabia is not making these decisions in isolation. The kingdom has applied to join the BRICS framework, the grouping of major non Western economies that increasingly functions as an alternative institutional architecture to the dollar dominated post 1945 system. The exact status of that membership has shifted through multiple announcements and clarifications, but the direction of travel is unmistakable. Riyadh has also deepened ties with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Security Framework led by China and Russia. Each institutional affiliation represents a hedge against the previous American led architecture, and the cumulative effect is a Saudi foreign policy that no longer treats Washington as the default coordinating partner for regional and global initiatives. The Russia angle compounds the picture in ways the Western press has been slow to integrate. Riyadh and Moscow have functioned as the two leading powers within OPEC Plus since 2016, coordinating production decisions that have repeatedly contradicted American preferences. That coordination did not collapse when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 and faced unprecedented Western sanctions. It deepened. Saudi Arabia continued to coordinate oil policy with a Russian government that Washington had designated as a strategic adversary and continued to do so even when explicitly asked to break that coordination in the interest of damaging Russian war financing. The refusal was polite. It was also unmistakable. Saudi Arabia made clear that its commercial energy interests would not be subordinated to American geopolitical priorities and that the OPEC Plus framework would survive the war regardless of how Washington felt about it. That refusal carried strategic implications far beyond oil markets. It signaled to every other middle power watching the global system that the United States no longer commands automatic compliance from its traditional partners on issues of consequence. If Saudi Arabia could refuse, others could refuse. If Riyadh could coordinate openly with Moscow despite American objections, other capitals could pursue analogous arrangements. The diplomatic precedent has been doing quiet work across multiple regions ever since, and the accumulated effect is a global system in which American leverage has measurably diminished without any single dramatic event marking the transition. Here's what the most candid analysis from inside Western foreign ministries will tell you off the record about the trajectory. The Saudi American relationship is not ending. It is being downgraded from an exclusive alliance to a transactional partnership. The kingdom will continue to buy American weapons, continue to host American military facilities, continue to engage in diplomatic dialogue at high levels. What it will no longer do is treat Washington's preferences as decisive when they conflict with Saudi commercial interests, regional ambitions, or relationships with other major powers. That downgrade is not reversible through better diplomacy or improved personal relationships between leaders. It reflects a structural rebalancing of global power in which China has become indispensable to Saudi commercial future and Russia has become useful to Saudi regional positioning, while the United States has become merely one of several important partners rather than the singular protector and patron. What does that mean concretely for the United States? It means that within a decade, the petrodollar arrangement that underwrote American fiscal flexibility for 50 years will have been substantially modified, with measurable consequences for borrowing costs, currency dynamics, and the structural advantages American consumers have enjoyed without recognizing them. It means that Middle Eastern security crises will increasingly involve Chinese diplomatic involvement on terms that constrain American options. It means that the assumption underlying decades of American foreign policy, which is that the Gulf monarchies are reliable partners who will align with Washington on consequential issues, can no longer be safely made. The most recent Saudi defense agreement with the United States, the much discussed strategic partnership framework that Washington has presented as evidence of relationship stabilization, deserves close examination because it illustrates the new pattern rather than reversing it. The agreement provides certain American security commitments and weapons access in exchange for Saudi cooperation on specific economic and political issues. It does not require Saudi exclusivity in defense partnerships. It does not require Saudi alignment on energy policy. It does not roll back the Chinese commercial relationships, the BRICS engagement, the OPEC Plus coordination with Russia, or the UN settlement experiments. It is, in effect, a transactional framework that allows both sides to extract specific benefits while preserving Saudi strategic autonomy across every dimension where that autonomy is being exercised in directions Washington dislikes. That is the deal, plainly described. The United States has accepted in practice, if not in rhetoric, that Saudi Arabia is no longer an exclusive partner. The acceptance is being managed through diplomatic language designed to obscure the substantive shift, but the substantive shift has occurred and continues to deepen. Now consider the timeline because the timing of when these consequences become visible to ordinary American consumers matters more than most analysts admit. Three predictions with clocks attached. First, within 18 months, expect a publicly disclosed expansion of yuan settlement for Saudi oil exports to Asian buyers, structured in a way that is presented as commercial diversification but represents a meaningful percentage increase over current volumes. The announcement will be diplomatic. The substance will be structural. Watch for the specific language used in the joint communique, because the absence of dollar exclusivity language will tell you more than the presence of any new commitment. Second, within 36 months, expect a significant Saudi defense procurement decision involving Chinese systems for a function previously dominated by American suppliers. The most likely candidates involve drone systems, missile defense components, or electronic warfare capabilities. The procurement will be defended as diversification. The strategic implication will be the breaking of American monopoly in a specific defense category that previously created lock-in. Third, within 60 months, expect a regional security crisis in the Middle East that is resolved through a diplomatic framework involving Chinese mediation as a primary rather than secondary actor. The American role will be present but not decisive. That single event, when it occurs, will mark the moment when even the most reluctant Western analyst can no longer deny that the regional security architecture has fundamentally changed. What unfolds between Riyadh and Washington over the next decade will not look like a divorce, will not generate dramatic headlines on most days, and will not feature the kind of clear inflection points that American political systems are designed to respond to. That is precisely why the realignment is succeeding from the Saudi perspective: slow, patient, commercial rather than confrontational, built around contracts and partnerships rather than around dramatic announcements. By the time the consequences become unmistakable to American audiences, the structural position will already be locked in, and the response options available to Washington will be dramatically narrower than they are today. The mainstream coverage of this story focuses on individual incidents, particular meetings, isolated statements, and occasional summit photo opportunities. The actual story is the cumulative pattern across multiple dimensions of the relationship, the integrated strategy that the Saudi leadership has been executing with discipline for several years, and the long time horizons that no American political cycle has been able to match. That pattern is being analyzed here on this channel because it is not being analyzed honestly in the places where most Americans get their information about the world. Here's the question for the comments, and consider it carefully before you answer. Which happens first, a major public announcement of expanded yuan settlement for Saudi oil exports, a Chinese-mediated resolution of a Middle Eastern security crisis with the United States in a secondary role, or a Saudi defense procurement that explicitly displaces a previously dominant American supplier? Drop your prediction below with your reasoning. Every comment gets read, and the strongest analyses will be featured in the follow-up video on this topic. If this gave you a framework that mainstream coverage didn't, a way to see the slow disassembly of an 80-year alliance underneath the daily diplomatic theater, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually being decided between Riyadh and Beijing right now, while official Washington keeps insisting that everything is fine. The next video goes inside the specific mechanics of how the petrodollar system is being modified through Saudi-Chinese commercial arrangements, and how close those arrangements are to producing measurable effects on American borrowing costs and currency dynamics. The numbers will be uncomfortable. Subscribe so you're there when it lands.